First, history teaches us a simple rule. People come first. Cities follow. Villages grow. Towns expand. Capitals emerge slowly. Brick by brick. Generation by generation. But there is a problem with this rule. When the camera finally learned how to remember for us, the story stopped behaving the way history said it should. And once you see that problem, you can't unsee it. For thousands of years, history relied on interpretation. Paintings, chronicles, stories written by people who decided what mattered. Then, in the 19th century, something changed. Photography appeared. For the first time, cities were recorded without opinion, without symbolism, without intention. The camera did not care what historians wanted the past to look like. It only captured what stood in front of it. And what it captured was strange. Across Europe, across North America, across newly claimed colonial capitals, the same pattern appears again and again. Wide boulevards stretching to the horizon, monumental buildings carved with extreme precision, domes, arches, columns, perfectly aligned, and almost no people, not a few, not a crowd pulled aside, but entire districts, empty. The standard explanation arrives quickly. Long exposure times. We're told that early cameras required several seconds or minutes to capture an image. Anything that moved simply didn't appear. But this explanation collapses the moment you slow down and actually think about it. Long exposure does not erase existence. It blurs motion. A busy street should leave shadows, smears, ghost-like streaks of activity. Yet in thousands of photographs, we see something else entirely. Stillness. No carts frozen mid-motion. No blurred pedestrians. No evidence of crowds dissolving into mist. Just stone, clean streets, untouched surfaces, pristine architecture. These cities do not look paused. They look unused. Now step back and consider scale. These were not modest settlements. These were cities designed for massive populations, roads wide enough for parades, public buildings capable of hosting tens of thousands, infrastructure that assumes constant, heavy use. But census records from the same period tell a different story, populations that barely scratch the surface of what these cities were built to handle. Avenue widths built for crowds that did not yet exist. Transit systems designed for volume before volume arrived. Civic buildings larger than the needs of the time. Why build so much for so few? History tells us this was optimism, industrial ambition, faith in growth. But optimism does not pour granite. Hope does not carve stone at this scale. This kind of construction answers to certainty, not belief. Here is the detail that changes everything. Many of these cities appear finished the moment photography begins documenting them. Not under construction, not halfway built. Finished, and already aging. This creates a timing problem historians rarely address. If these cities were built by the people who lived in them, why do we see the cities first and the people later? Why does the visual record show infrastructure before density? Why do early photographs feel like introductions to places waiting for occupants? This is not how organic urban growth behaves. Organic growth is messy, crowded, incremental. These cities appear prepared. Now imagine a different possibility. Not that people built the cities, but that the cities already existed and the people arrived afterward. This single reversal explains everything the official narrative struggles with. Why architecture outpaces population. Why cities look empty yet complete. Why infrastructure seems oversized for its era. It suggests something deeply unsettling. That the population of the 19th century did not build its world. It inherited it. And inheritance comes with no memory of construction. Look closely at the photographs again. What's missing is not just people. It's where. No heavy soot on facades. No erosion consistent with long-term use. No clutter of daily life. These cities do not look lived in. They look activated later, as if they were turned on. As if someone unlocked the doors. At this point, the question is unavoidable. If people didn't build the cities, then who did? And where did those builders go? History offers no answer, not because it investigated and failed, but because it never asked. And this is where the first crack appears in the official story, because at the exact moment these empty cities appear in the photographic record, something else begins happening, something enormous, something global, something even harder to explain. Children, not families. Children. At the precise moment cities stand empty, the world begins filling with children who have no past. If cities appeared before their people, then the next question is unavoidable. Where did the people come from? History offers an answer so familiar we rarely question it. War, disease, poverty. But when we look at the numbers, that answer collapses. In the middle of the 19th century, something unprecedented happened. Across Europe, across North America, across Russia, children began appearing in enormous numbers. Not families with children, not communities growing naturally. Children, alone. They arrived without parents, without documentation, without clear origin. Orphanhood is not unusual in history. What is unusual is scale, and this scale has no precedent before or after. Let's be precise. Some 19th century orphan institutions recorded thousands of infants at a time, not over decades. Not cumulatively, simultaneously, single facilities housing 4,000, 5,000, even more. Entire complexes built not for dozens but for industrial volumes of children. And these were not temporary shelters. They were permanent, monumental structures. Here is the problem. Children do not appear in those numbers accidentally. History insists this was caused by tragedy. Wars create orphans, but wars are localized, time-bound, uneven. Yet orphan surges appear in regions untouched by major conflict. Disease creates abandonment, but epidemics spike and recede. These institutions filled steadily for decades. Poverty forces parents to surrender children. But poverty existed long before the 19th century. It never produced this scale. Every explanation explains some children. None explain millions, and none explain the synchronization. Here is the detail that should stop any serious historian cold. This phenomenon was not regional, it was global. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, all experience the same surge. All build massive institutions. All report children with missing origins. All within the same narrow window of time. Tragedy does not synchronize like this. Planning does. Now examine the paperwork. This is where things become truly disturbing. Birth records do not match intake numbers. Parental names are missing. Places of birth are vague or absent. Entire columns simply read unknown again and again. Thousands of children processed with no traceable source, no corresponding spike in recorded childbirth, no disaster proportional enough to explain it. Children appear. Paperwork does not follow. Return now to something we touched on in episode 1. Timing. These orphan institutions did not grow slowly in response to need. They already existed. Large, organized, staffed, as if someone expected the children, as if capacity preceded crisis. This reverses the entire humanitarian narrative. You don't build storage unless you expect inventory. Now step back and see what this really means. A generation emerges without ancestry. Children raised without family memory. without inherited stories, without lineage tying them to the past. They would grow up knowing only what they were told, and what they were told would define history for everyone who followed. This is how memory resets, not through destruction, through replacement. There is a question that history never asks, not because it's difficult, but because the answer is terrifying. If these children were not the result of catastrophe, then they were supplied. And if children were supplied, then this was not a crisis, it was a system. Emergency systems react, they do not anticipate. You don't build a dam after the flood recedes. You don't construct a warehouse unless you expect inventory. And yet, in the 19th century, the buildings meant to house millions of children were already standing. History frames the rise of orphan institutions as reactive, a moral response, a humanitarian effort, a necessary adaptation to tragedy. But real emergency responses share common traits. They are improvised, they are uneven, they are chaotic. These institutions were none of those things. They were permanent, monumental, standardized, built of stone, laid out with precision, designed to process volume. This is not what reaction looks like. This is preparation. Let's talk about scale again. Not dozens of cribs, not a few dormitories. Entire complexes, long halls lined with identical beds, administrative wings, storage facilities, medical sections, processing offices. Some orphanages rivaled palaces in size. And here is the detail that matters most. They were not built gradually. They appear complete in the historical record. As if activated, architecture tells the truth when words do not. You can read intention in layout. These buildings were not designed to nurture families. They were designed to manage throughput. Children enter. Children are categorized. Children are stored. Children are transferred. This is not shelter. It is intake. And intake implies supply. If millions of children suddenly appeared organically, the historical record should scream panic, debate, public outrage, emergency legislation. But what we see instead is calm, order, administration. Reports written in neutral language, budgets calmly allocated, staff hired systematically, as if the event was expected, as if protocols were already in place. Now follow the money. These were not cheap buildings, stone construction, large staff, long-term maintenance. Governments did not scramble to fund them. They approved them. Churches did not protest their burden. They integrated them. Philanthropists did not hesitate. They planned. No emergency fundraising drives, no widespread financial panic, just quiet coordination. And here we encounter another silence. These institutions meticulously recorded what happened inside them. Daily routines, staff roles, budgets, transfers. But records grow strangely vague at the point of origin. Where the children came from, who delivered them, how they arrived in such numbers. This information fades, as if deliberately excluded. Listen carefully to the language used in surviving documents. Capacity, overflow, allocation, placement. These are not emotional terms, they are logistical ones. They describe systems handling volume, not families handling grief. When you step back, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Cities stood ready. Institutions stood ready. Children arrived, not as a shock, but as a fulfillment. This was not society reacting to loss. This was society executing a plan. Now consider the long-term consequence. Children raised without family memory inherit only what institutions teach them. No ancestral loyalty, no inherited identity, no cultural continuity. They become the perfect foundation for a new population, flexible, adaptable, compliant. History does not like to say this out loud, but systems do not erase memory by force. They replace it. And once the children were processed, they did not remain in these buildings. They were moved. Charity shelters. That is the phrase we are given. But charity keeps people close. Charity stabilizes. Charity does not transport human beings across continents on fixed schedules. This episode is not about care. It is about movement. Once the orphan institutions reached capacity, something happened that rarely receives scrutiny. The children began to leave. Not slowly, not sporadically, systematically. Across the 19th century, records show the organized relocation of enormous numbers of children. Not families migrating together, not refugees fleeing danger. Children alone, moving along predetermined routes. In the United States, this system became visible in a way that cannot be ignored. The orphan trains. Between the mid-1800s and early 1900s, more than 200,000 children were transported from eastern cities to rural and frontier regions. This was not an occasional initiative. It ran for decades. Trains departed on schedules. Routes were planned in advance. Communities were notified. Children arrived in groups so large they filled entire rail cars. This is not emergency evacuation. This is distribution. When the trains arrived, the process did not resemble family adoption. Children were lined up, inspected, chosen. Height, strength, health, temperament. Some families selected children like livestock at a market. Others received assignments. Siblings were often separated, even when no practical reason existed to do so. Why? Because lineage mattered less than placement. Now pay attention to the language used in surviving documents. Not love, not compassion. Not belonging. Words like placement, assignment, transfer, relocation. These are the words of logistics. They describe inventory movement, not family formation. It would be comforting to believe this was an American anomaly. It was not. Europe maintained similar systems. Russia categorized children by future utility. Colonial territories received shipments of young settlers. Entire regions that had been sparsely populated suddenly filled with young people whose origins were difficult to trace. This was not random resettlement. It followed infrastructure, rail lines, shipping routes, agricultural expansion. Children moved where labor and population were needed. Here is where the story becomes colder. These transfers were well documented. Dates, destinations, numbers. But one thing is consistently missing: origins. Children arrived with little or no personal history, no parents to verify identity, no extended family to reclaim them, no past to question. They were blank slates. A population without roots is extraordinarily malleable. No inherited rivalries, no ancestral land claims, no cultural memory tying them to what came before. They grow into the environment they are placed into. They accept the story they are taught. And most importantly, they do not ask what existed before them. Once again, timing refuses to behave randomly. The relocation of children accelerates at the same moment. Cities transition from empty to occupied. Industrial centers expand. Colonial regions stabilize. Population appears exactly where infrastructure demands it. This is not coincidence. This is deployment. At this point, the shape of the system becomes unmistakable. Cities prepared in advance, children supplied in bulk, institutions processed them, transportation networks distributed them, every component aligns. This is not social welfare, this is demographic engineering, but distribution only works if supply is consistent, and that raises a question history never answers. The glass rooms hospitals hide their patients. Factories hide their machinery. But in the late 19th century, something unprecedented happened. Human infants were placed behind glass and displayed to the public. If you were alive in the late 1800s and wanted to see the newest medical technology, you didn't go to a clinic. You went to an amusement park, boardwalks, world fairs, expositions built for entertainment, spectacle, and crowds, and tucked between roller coasters, candy stands, and mechanical marvels, visitors encountered something profoundly unsettling. Rows of infants, alive, breathing, sleeping, encased in glass machines. These were early incubators, metal frames, glass walls, hissing valves. They regulated temperature and airflow, creating artificial environments designed to keep newborns alive. Official history tells us this was a humanitarian effort. Hospitals refused to adopt the technology, so innovators brought it to the public. But that explanation fractures under scrutiny. Because these incubators were not rare, they appeared in large numbers, entire halls filled with them. Here is the question that history avoids. Where did all these infants come from? Not a handful, not a dozen, hundreds, thousands. Premature infants require extraordinary conditions to survive, yet these exhibitions operated continuously for years. This is not occasional rescue, this is sustained supply. Look closely at how these infants were presented. Visitors paid admission, signs advertised the attraction, nurses performed their duties in full view of crowds, infants were numbered, catalogued, identified not by name, but by position. This is not how emergency medicine behaves. This is how systems demonstrate capability. Ask the uncomfortable question. Why display vulnerable human life? Why not treat these infants quietly? Why expose them to crowds? Because display serves a purpose. Display conditions acceptance. When people see something often enough, they stop questioning whether it should exist at all. Glass does not just protect. It separates. It turns life into an object. Visitors didn't recoil. They marveled. Newspapers described the exhibitions as wonders. Parents brought children. Crowds applauded survival rates. This matters, because it shows that society was being taught, gently, slowly, to accept artificial human nurturing as normal. Not hidden, not secret. Public. Again, paperwork reveals a silence. Many infants had no recorded parents, no birth hospitals, no traceable origin. They simply arrived, delivered to the exhibition, assigned to machines, kept alive, and eventually removed. Where they went next is rarely documented. Here is where the puzzle tightens. These incubator exhibitions often appeared beside displays promoting population improvement. Better humans, stronger citizens, optimized traits. This was not subtle. The message was clear. Human life could be managed, improved, controlled. Taken together, the incubator exhibitions no longer resemble charity. They resemble prototypes, proof of concept, a demonstration that large numbers of infants could survive without families, without mothers, without traditional birth structures. This is not about saving life, it is about proving scalability. And while the public was taught to accept artificial nurturing, something else was happening. When reality creates a gap, stories rush in to fill it. Not because people are foolish, but because humans cannot live without explanation. And in the 19th century, a gap appeared that could not be spoken out loud. For most of human history, one question never needed an answer. Where did I come from? The answer was visible. Parents, family, community. But when millions of children began life without parents, without lineage, without witnesses, that question became dangerous. Because unanswered origin questions destabilize identity. so culture intervened. We are told that children's origin myths are ancient, that they emerged organically, that they were passed down through generations. But when we examine timing, the story breaks apart. The explosion of child origin folklore does not precede the orphan surge. It follows it. Storks delivering babies, children found in cabbage patches, infants arriving from somewhere else. These stories appear suddenly and spread rapidly, across countries, across languages, across cultures. This is not how ancient folklore behaves. This is how solutions behave. These myths share a critical feature. They remove parents from the equation. No mother, no father, no lineage, just delivery, arrival, placement. The story doesn't answer who created the child. It answers why you don't need to ask. And once a society accepts symbolic origins, it stops demanding real ones. Notice something else. These myths are gentle, non-threatening, even charming. They do not frighten children. They soothe them. They transform uncertainty into wonder. And that is precisely why they are effective. A child who believes they arrived magically does not feel abandoned. They feel chosen. Now step back and look at the larger pattern. Empty cities. Children without parents. Institutions without origin records. Artificial nurturing displayed publicly. All of this creates tension. Myth dissolves tension. It stitches over breaks in memory. It explains without revealing. This wasn't just for children. Adults needed these stories as much as anyone, because accepting the truth that a generation appeared without origin would have shattered society. It would have forced questions no institution could answer. So myth became a mercy, a way to move forward without looking backward. Once these stories settled into culture, something remarkable happened. No one questioned missing parents. No one demanded birth records. The absence became normal. Children grew up and repeated the same stories to their own children. The patch became tradition, and tradition feels ancient even when it isn't. This is important. Memory was not destroyed, it was redirected. Instead of remembering what happened, society remembered what felt safer. Myth does not eliminate truth. It hides it in plain sight. By the end of the 19th century, something irreversible had occurred. A population existed that believed its origins were ordinary, that believed the cities around them were built by ancestors they never met, that believed history flowed smoothly. The reset no longer needed protection. It had become invisible. But stories don't just explain, they sell. Stories explain, but objects testify. You can dismiss rumors. You can reinterpret myths. But artifacts remain stubbornly physical. And the 19th century left behind artifacts that do not behave the way history says they should. They are rarely discussed in textbooks, rarely catalogued in museums. Most are found by accident, in attic boxes, in flea markets, in forgotten collections, old postcards. At first glance, they appear harmless, even playful. Babies in baskets, babies delivered by storks, babies growing in fields. But when you begin to collect them, not one, not 10, but hundreds, something changes. Patterns emerge, and patterns do not lie. Humor varies wildly by culture. What one nation finds funny, another ignores. But these postcards appear everywhere. France, Germany, Britain, the United States, the Netherlands, Austria, different artists, different publishers, the same imagery, the same themes, the same strange fixation. Babies treated not as children, but as items. Look closely at what these cards depict. Babies weighed on scales, babies wrapped in paper, babies stacked like produce, babies shipped in crates, babies displayed in shop windows. Some are labeled, some are numbered, some are tagged with descriptions. I am strong. I will be good. I won't cry. This is not whimsy. This is merchandising language. Then there is the text. On many cards, phrases appear again and again. For sale. No returns. Repopulation. These are not metaphors. They are operational words. Words used by systems, not by fairy tales. If these were isolated jokes, history would have forgotten them naturally. But this was a global visual culture, mass-produced, widely circulated, understood instantly by audiences of the time. Which raises a dangerous question. What shared understanding made these images funny instead of horrifying? Humor only works when the audience already recognizes the reference. In episode 6, we explored how myths replaced parents. Here we see the next phase. The myth becomes marketable. Children don't just arrive, they are delivered, selected, distributed. The same logic used by the orphan systems, wrapped in charm. Here is one of the most telling details. There is no serious academic body of work on these postcards, no comprehensive catalogue, no deep analysis, despite their volume, despite their global spread. They are treated as curiosities, not evidence. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a decision. Let's return to one word, repopulation. Not renewal, not growth, not birth. Repopulation, a term used after loss, after collapse, after emptiness. This word ties the postcards directly to the empty cities, to the orphan institutions, to the distribution networks. It names the process. These postcards survived because they were harmless, until someone looked too closely. They were playful enough to escape scrutiny, common enough to avoid suspicion. But when placed beside the evidence we've already seen, they stop being jokes. They become documentation. Visual normalization of something too vast to explain openly. When objects, institutions, and logistics all tell the same story, the story is no longer accidental. At some point, evidence stops feeling like coincidence, not because one piece is convincing, but because too many pieces align, different origins, different formats, different purposes, all pointing in the same direction. Up to now, we've examined fragments, empty cities, children without origins, institutions built in advance, transportation systems for minors, public incubator exhibitions, cultural myths replacing parents, postcards advertising repopulation. Each anomaly can be dismissed alone. But systems don't appear alone. They appear when independent elements begin behaving as one. And that is what the 19th century shows us. Let's lay the pieces out without interpretation. Cities exist before population density. Children appear without lineage. Facilities exist before intake. Transportation follows infrastructure. Technology proves scalability. Culture normalizes absence. Artifacts encode the message. This is not a chain of accidents. This is a workflow. Preparation, intake, stabilization, distribution, normalization. Every step is accounted for. History insists this century was about growth. But growth behaves differently. Growth is uneven, messy, localized. What we see instead is synchronized, global, orderly, predictable. The population does not expand outward from families, it appears in bulk, and bulk appearance demands a different explanation. The word reset is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean everything was destroyed. It means continuity was broken. Imagine a world where infrastructure survives, Knowledge partially survives. Cities survive, but people do not. In that world, the fastest way forward is not rebuilding, it is refilling. And refilling requires a population that does not remember what came before. Adults carry memory. Adults carry allegiance, claims, grievances. Children do not. Children adapt. They accept the world they are given. They learn the story they are taught. They grow into the system without questioning its origin. If a civilization needed to restart quietly, children would not be a tragedy. They would be the solution. Notice what all the anomalies share. Missing origins, no builders, no parents, no ancestors. This is not neglect. This is design. A population without origin stories does not challenge ownership, does not demand inheritance, does not question legitimacy. They accept that the world simply has always been this way. If this process occurred, it could never be written openly, not because it was evil, but because it was destabilizing. A population learning it was installed, not born into continuity, would fracture. Institutions would lose legitimacy, borders would lose meaning. So the record does something subtle. It documents everything except the beginning. It records what happened after, never what caused it. This is why the reset feels invisible. No dramatic collapse is remembered. No global catastrophe is agreed upon. No single villain exists. The transition feels smooth because the new population had nothing to compare it to. Memory did not need to be erased. It was replaced. Once a generation grows up believing its origins are ordinary, the reset is complete. History continues forward. The old world becomes myth. The infrastructure feels ancient. And the question, what happened before, fades into irrelevance. That is the moment the reset succeeds. But if this hypothesis is true, then we are not just studying history, we are studying ourselves. If the reset hypothesis is wrong, then history is merely incomplete. But if it is even partially true, then something far more disturbing follows. It means the past we remember may not be the past that happened. History is not just a record of events, it is a foundation. It tells us who built our cities, who fought our wars, who our ancestors were. It anchors identity. So when history changes, identity shifts with it. And that is why this subject feels so uncomfortable. Because the moment we question continuity, we begin questioning ourselves. Many people have noticed something quietly strange. Family trees often dissolve around the early 1800s, records thin, names disappear, origins become vague. This is usually blamed on poor documentation, but poor documentation should be uneven. Instead, the collapse appears again and again, across regions, across cultures, as if a starting point was imposed, not a beginning of humanity, but a beginning of this version of humanity. Consider what it means to inherit a world you did not build, cities already standing, borders already drawn, institutions already defined. To the inheritor, these things feel ancient, not because they are old, but because no living memory contradicts them. This is how permanence is manufactured, not by age, but by silence. A reset built on adults would fracture. Adults ask questions, they compare, they remember. But children accept the world as baseline reality. They learn its rules without resistance. They internalize its narratives. And once they become adults, the reset no longer requires enforcement. It enforces itself. There is no recorded moment where one world ends and another begins, no ceremony, no declaration, because the handoff was generational. The builders vanish, the new population grows up, and by the time they reach adulthood, the question, who built this, feels irrelevant. The world simply is. The rapid technological rise of the late 19th and early 20th centuries suddenly looks different. railways, telegraphs, electric grids, standardized education. This does not resemble discovery. It resembles configuration, like a system being brought online, not invented from scratch, but activated. This theory unsettles people not because it's dark, but because it destabilizes lineage. If continuity was broken, then ancestry becomes conditional, not erased, but truncated. And that raises a quiet question most people never voice. How far back do we really go? Why would such a reset remain hidden? Because remembering would fracture legitimacy. Governments, institutions, ownership, borders, all depend on continuity. A reset remembered becomes a reset contested. Silence maintains stability. This series is not asking you to accept a conclusion. It is asking you to notice a pattern, to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that history is not a neutral observer. It is curated, and curated histories shape future behavior. If continuity was engineered, then forgetting was never an accident. Every investigation reaches a moment where the evidence stops. Not because the truth is exhausted, but because the next step no longer belongs to the investigator. It belongs to the listener. From the beginning, this series appeared to be about history. Photographs, architecture, children, institutions. But that was only the surface. Because history is not just a record of what happened. It is a framework that defines what feels possible. And once that framework is questioned, the implications extend forward, not backward. This was never about the 1800s. It was about now. If the reset hypothesis is wrong, then we lose nothing by questioning it. But if it is partially true, then something profound follows. It means civilization may not be as old as we believe, not as continuous, not as inevitable. It means societies can be reset quietly, repopulated, reoriented, and most importantly, it means the stories we inherit are not guaranteed to be complete. People often ask why ideas like this are never discussed seriously. The answer is simple. Because they don't threaten facts, they threaten legitimacy. Borders rely on continuity. Institutions rely on ancestry. Authority relies on memory that flows in one direction. A reset acknowledged becomes a reset questioned. And questions destabilize systems that depend on belief. We often think of roads, buildings, and machines as infrastructure. But memory is infrastructure too. Shared memory tells us what is normal, what is ancient, what is unquestionable. If memory can be curated, then reality can be shaped without force. The strongest systems are not enforced. They are believed. If a reset happened once, it means resets are possible, not necessarily identical, not necessarily physical, but structural. Demographic shifts, narrative rewrites, cultural reprogramming. These do not require collapse. They require silence. They require people to stop asking where things came from. There is one question more dangerous than what happened. And that question is, how would we know if it happened again? If a reset leaves infrastructure intact, keeps daily life stable, and replaces memory gradually, then detection becomes almost impossible. Unless people learn to recognize patterns. Patterns are not proof. They are warnings. They tell us where to look more closely. They tell us when official explanations strain under their own weight. They tell us when coincidence becomes choreography. This series does not offer certainty. It offers literacy. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. But seeing does not require belief. It requires honesty, the willingness to say, I don't know, and to stay with that discomfort rather than rushing back to certainty. That is the responsibility of awareness. The past is not settled. It is continuously rewritten through interpretation. What matters is not whether this hypothesis is accepted. What matters is whether people remain curious enough to challenge inherited stories. Because once curiosity dies, control becomes effortless. This series does not end with answers. It ends with a posture. Pay attention to gaps. Notice scale mismatches. Question narratives that feel too smooth. History is not just what we remember. It is what we are allowed to forget. The past may be stranger than we imagine, but the future depends on whether we dare to look. The investigation continues.